of this, that, or the other thing. This is what we agreed on. And I mean, is it not what we agreed on or whatever? I mean, obviously you don't want to be condescending or anything, but it's just so much easier for people to look back at this document and be like, you know what, you're right. I don't know what happened on my end, and yeah, okay, but let's get to it. And if it doesn't go that way, and let's just say, hey, look, I'm sorry, but things keep coming up, and I can't go with this anymore. That also outlines what that process is going to be like too. And it's just so much easier when if things don't work well, or even when they do, that you have a defined path on what's the procedure and how to work through them. Because like a marketing plan and all other things that we talk about, if you kind of have a plan in place and know what's going to happen or know what to do in those events, you're going to have so much less to worry about. Whereas if you don't have any of these things in place and then they happen, it's like, oh, crap. And then it becomes not necessarily a legal issue. It becomes an emotional one. And that's where friends lose friends. And that's the last thing we want happen to people.
Nobody wants that. I mean, working with people is hard. And that's not like, it sounds obvious, but like really, it legitimately is. Like you could take all of the best people in the world and put them in a room, and somewhere along the line working on a project, you're going to find disagreements on things.
Right.
And so I think having, kind of a unanimous environment, at the very least in the early stages, where you're all on the same page about what's expected of you, it avoids conflict. So, yeah, I mean, even beyond, kind of the legal sense and what all of that means, just from an interpersonal standpoint and communication and the value of that, on the base level, I think having an agreement and being legitimate protects you in that way as well.
Yeah, totally. All right. Well, with that said, I think we covered quite a bit in terms of what an operating agreement helps, provide for the company, why it's necessary, and that type of stuff. Let's take it back a little bit too. So let's say you've made the decision, regardless if you're a solo dev or a group of people, to you want to start the process in forming a company, right? An entity, essentially. Now, what should you register as? And if you don't mind me asking, Mustapha, what did you register as?
So our company is registered as an LLC.
Okay. And from my perspective, in terms of RenGen, it's registered as an LLC too. So how is your process in terms of determining that, and why did you do that over other entities such as like an S Corp or an E Corp?
Right. I think when you're talking about independent games, 9 times out of 10, it just comes down to scale.
Yeah.
I think a lot of these other business models are really built around pretty short-term growth. And for us, growing even beyond just the 3 of us is something that we don't really foresee happening until well beyond, a couple of projects. So to that end, we did break it all down. We actually we lucked out big time. One of our guys is was studying like pre-law and stuff at the time, and was looking to go into law school and everything. And so he kind of broke down a lot of the legal process for us. So we didn't end up like hiring a lawyer to go over this, but we did definitely look into a bunch of these kind of differences. We took a very in-depth looked at all of our finances and resources, and discussed what we saw our kind of vision for the team being in the long term. And based on that, LLC definitely seemed like the way to go.
Yeah, and for people who are like, okay, what the heck does any of this mean? Basically, like a C Corp and S Corp, they're just really focused on instead. I'm probably not really going to go into any of this because I am not the person to talk to about any of this. But it's like short for corporation, right? And when you think of corporation, you're thinking of much larger entities. The two, some of the differences are partially dealing with size. They're also dealing with like having shareholders and that type of stuff. So as Mustapha pretty much conveniently alluded to, they're much essentially bigger entities compared to what most of the people that we're talking today about this with. And that's why you wouldn't necessarily be considered with that. However, it is still very important to get a better and full understanding of what that is, and because there's going to be other benefits associated with it too, like tax benefits, and other and how you're taxed as an S corp versus a C corp or versus an LLC. So those are all things to be very super mindful, but I would have to say probably 9 times out of 10, if not more, you're going to be looking, if you are interested in filing and creating a separate entity, it's most likely going to be an LLC. Now, all right, we talked about a little bit as far as what kind of company you would probably file as. What does that look like for people like I guess we can use ourselves in this situation. What would that look like for you? Which you pretty much, I think, already summed it up. And what would that look like for someone like me? Because for me, for the most part, it's primarily myself. But for you, you have a team. So how is that structured in terms of that particular entity?
Right. So, I mean, we broke it down to 3 equivalent shares. So we all have kind of equal power and equal investment financially and all of that kind of within the business. So, and we feel like that's good because, I feel like the smaller your group is, the more checks and balances are needed. You don't necessarily have to have leadership in the traditional sense. Everybody should have an expertise, but from a functional standpoint, that seemed to make the most sense. So, I mean, it definitely ended up being a lot of very preliminary research on our part. Thankfully, I think just based on like research alone, New Hampshire seems to be one of those states where it's perhaps a little bit less stringent, both in way of kind of the rules as well as the cost of filing. Now, as far as like the structure of it all, we basically sat down, we went over the differences of the 3 types of businesses, and then we went over those costs within kind of our local area. And then we also broke down kind of how to go about the other steps. And this is, I guess, where I would get into some of the jargon, like setting up your, getting your tax ID, setting up your corporate bank account. And so we kind of came into the determination around that. At the time, we were also, I think, a little bit overzealous, where we were also kind of like trying to get parts of our first project off the ground. And we ended up kind of putting that on the back burner to work on something a little bit different. But I would say that that's probably sums up the very early parts of what we were doing. Okay,
cool. And I think if I can remember some of this jargon correctly, when you guys are filed as an LLC, and because there's multiple people involved that have like equal shares, I think that is considered as a manager operated, don't quote me 100% on that, a manager operated LLC. And then the other side of it, which is more essentially how I operate from, is a sole proprietorship LLC. So that on my perspective is really kind of tied to me directly, but not 100% directly, in the case that the LLC itself is even though I'm tied to it, it's a separate entity. So what that means for me, and this could probably relate to a lot of people considering whether or not to create a company that are solo devs, having that LLC, you still pretty much operate completely independently and make all the core decisions around your company. But in the event you are at least recognized from a state perspective or even a national perspective of being a separate entity, and it's not just you as an individual, as a person. And then obviously from that you get other benefits too, like Mustapha said, you can get your tax ID number and for the company, or I think it's a EID or something like that, identification
the
number.
EIN, yeah.
And there's other benefits too. I mean, we mentioned the protection aspect of it and everything else, but one thing that comes up too is like getting your own bank account. And there's definitely a difference between a personal and business account. Now, I will say and admit that when I started out, before I had filed for an LLC, I did get a separate bank account, which happened to be at that time a personal bank account. And for anybody who's maybe, let's say, on the fence about doing that, at the very least, I would go ahead and at least open up a personal separate bank account. If that's your intention, it's a good segue, because what happened in my case, if you don't have to do that, then by all means don't. But in my case, I did that because I knew the importance of separating my expenses. And it was probably an obvious one for you, Mustapha, and especially others out there that are considering forming an entity or a company with multiple people, to have a separate account. But for people like that may be running a sole proprietorship or independently, that might not be a consideration. But this is the key thing, and it's like almost like a business 101 thing. You always want to make sure that you keep your personal assets outside of any of your business-related assets or spending in particular. And the main reason for that is if things get mixed up, regardless if you're a business or not, you're going to file for taxes. You have to, and if you don't, well, then you can face penalties and stuff like that later, right? But when you file for taxes, at some point the government, I know right now the government is just inundated with tons of like tax-related stuff, but eventually you could get audited. And if you get audited, you're going to have to explain, hey, why did this money go out here and this and this and this? And if everything's is being filtered through your personal account, it's going to make things a mess and a headache. And it's the last thing you want to have to deal with is the IRS asking all these crazy questions that you don't know the answers to, because your personal bank account is mixing up your the assets you acquired from Unity with your Amazon purchases. No one wants to go through that. So that's another very important reason to have a separate account at the very least. But you really want to make sure it's a business account, because again, that ties you, it separates you from being a personal thing. So that way, if anything ever does happen, you don't have to worry about that. And for tax purposes too, you're potentially seen as a separate entity. In my case, it's sole proprietorship. There's a particular form I fill out. It's still, attached to me or whatever, but because at the end of the day, everybody's going to have to pay taxes and how it's structured and everything else. But when it comes to the tax stuff, that's when you definitely want to reach out to accountants so you can further understand to a much greater depth than what we're providing here as far as what are the tax implications or responsibilities or whatever that you have to deal with.
Absolutely agreed.
Yeah, because like I said, you don't want to have to deal with the tax with the IRS, because it'll just be a pain in the butt. Another thing, though, to keep in mind with your tax account, your like a business bank account. So some people are like, oh wait, there's fees associated with that, and most banks, if not all, are going to have some types of fees associated with that. Some banks are going to be a little bit more friendly than others, or small business friendly. So it's good to do your research and find out. With me, it was a easier and natural transition for me to stay with my my current bank and or my personal bank. But what I found out through them too is when I contacted them, I was like, hey, look, I'm looking to open up a small, a business account. What kind of things do I need to know? What do you have? And so they have usually tiers types. So let's say if you're going to do a lot of transactions, let's say you're looking to sell swag and you want to have like a merchant center so your website can start processing cards. That's one feature that they can offer you there. Or you could go separate third party. But there's still some benefits there too, and you might get if you're using those services that might require a little bit more. It might be better to go third party. It might be cheaper to have that kind of all rolled in with your bank account. So those are things to consider. What was a really cool feature that I took advantage with my account, and it basically they said, hey, look, if you want to hit this level of banking, you get this many extra options. But in order to do that, you need to hit this threshold. And that's a concern with a lot of people in terms of hitting that, that threshold so they don't pay a fee. Like, how much money do you need sitting in your account, right? But they had a feature where if we link your account, now hold out for a minute and let me finish. If